It is the autumn of 1942, and somewhere in the gray, heaving waters of the Bay of Biscay, a German U-boat is running on the surface. She has been at sea for 3 weeks, and her crew of 44 men are tired, hungry, and ready to go home. The base at Lorient is perhaps 6 hours away. The commander is standing in the conning tower, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Just cloud and whitecaps and the smell of diesel exhaust. He gives the order to maintain course. Then the lookout hears it, a low, rhythmic thrumming. It comes from the south. The commander raises his binoculars and squints into the morning light, but there is nothing to see. The sound grows louder, closer. And then at last he spots the silhouette, a twin-engine aircraft, low and fast, skimming the wave tops. British, RAF Coastal Command. His stomach drops. He screams the order to dive. The alarm bell hammers through the boat. Men tumble down ladders and hatches slam shut. The diesel engines cut and the electric motors take over, and the submarine begins to slide beneath the surface. On the surface, the aircraft roars past. No bombs fall, no depth charges. The crew catch their breath. They made it. What they do not know, what none of them can possibly know, is that the aircraft already did its job, not by dropping anything, not by firing anything, but by switching off a light. The technology involved was so simple that it barely qualifies as a piece of equipment at all. It was a light bulb in a housing. But the idea behind it, the tactical principle that made it extraordinarily lethal, was one of the most elegant deceptions of the entire Second World War. It exploited not a weakness in German engineering, but a weakness in German biology, in the way human eyes work, in the way a man standing in a conning tower, squinting against the glare of the sky, simply cannot see something that is, by any reasonable measure, right in front of him. This is the story of the Leigh Light, and the men who used it to turn the Bay of Biscay into a killing ground. It is a story about the science of seeing and not seeing, about the gap between when a predator spots its prey and when the prey can spot the predator back, and about how a retired RAF wing commander named Humphrey Lee solved one of the most vexing tactical problems of the naval war with a piece of equipment that any reasonable person would have dismissed as absurdly straightforward. To understand why the Leigh Light mattered, you have to understand what the U-boat war looked like in its early years and how close Germany came to winning it. Between 1940 and 1942, the Atlantic was a catastrophe for the Allies. German submarines were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be built. In 1942 alone, more than 1,600 Allied vessels were lost to enemy action, the majority to U-boats. The raw numbers are staggering even now, over 6 million tons of shipping destroyed in a single year. The convoys carrying food, oil, ammunition, and war material from North America to Britain's were hemorrhaging cargoes and crews at a rate that Churchill privately believed could lose the war outright. He later wrote that the only thing that truly frightened him during the whole conflict was the U-boat peril. The Germans had developed a tactical innovation of their own that made them extraordinarily difficult to counter. U-boats, it turned out, were far more effective when they attacked on the surface at night rather than submerging and using torpedoes from depth. On the surface, a submarine could travel at nearly 18 knots, fast enough to outrun many escort ships and to reposition for multiple attack runs. Submerged, the same boat was reduced to perhaps 7 knots, and her battery power lasted only so long. The ocean at night was enormous and black, and a low-profile submarine, barely 2 meters above the waterline, was almost impossible to spot visually. Radar ought to have solved this, and to some extent, it did. Early air-to-surface vessel radar sets, known as AS-5, could detect a surfaced U-boat at ranges of several miles, which was revolutionary. Coastal Command aircraft fitted with AS-5 could vector in on a contact in the dark, prosecuting attacks that would have been utterly impossible a year before. In the first months of AS-5 use, results were encouraging. But then the Germans adapted. In the summer of 1942, the Kriegsmarine began fitting U-boats with a device called the Metox receiver, a simple radar detection set that could pick up the emissions of British ASV radar at a range significantly greater than the radar itself could detect the submarine. In effect, The U-boat heard the aircraft coming before the aircraft could see the U-boat. The moment a METOX set lit up its warning lamp, the crew dived. By the time the aircraft arrived at the last known position, there was nothing on the surface but a spreading patch of disturbed water and perhaps a few bubbles. The METOX transformed the tactical situation almost overnight. Sinkings attributed to aircraft plummeted. Coastal command squadrons were flying hundreds of hours of patrol time and achieving almost nothing. The Bay of Biscay, the crucial transit route that every U-boat had to cross to reach the Atlantic and return, became a sanctuary rather than a hunting ground. The mathematics were depressing. An aircraft could spend 8 hours on patrol and never once make a successful attack. Crews became demoralized. Commanders wrote increasingly frustrated reports. The window of vulnerability, the brief period during which a diving submarine was still near the surface, was exactly what needed to be exploited. But the darkness that the U-boats used as cover during their surface transits made them invisible, even when radar had located them. A radar contact gave a bearing and a range. It could not tell you the exact angle of approach for a bomb run. It could not illuminate a target for a visual attack, and at the altitudes and speeds involved, attacking a target you could not actually see was effectively impossible. What was needed was a way to illuminate a submarine during that final, critical approach without giving it enough warning to dive, something that would be invisible until it was too late. The man who solved this problem was not an engineer by training. Humphrey Leigh was a wing commander who had served in the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War and had spent the interwar years in the RAF before retiring. He was not a scientist. He was not attached to any of the prestigious research establishments that produced so many of the war's technical innovations. He was, in the most literal sense, an amateur in a world of professionals. Lee's insight was deceptively simple. The problem was darkness. The solution was light. But not just any light, a very specific kind of light, controlled in a very specific way. His device was, at its core, a powerful searchlight mounted in the nose or beneath the wing of a maritime patrol aircraft. The light itself was initially a 24-inch carbon arc lamp, drawing around 90 amps, producing approximately 60 million candela of focused, intense white light, enough to illuminate a surface submarine at ranges of up to 1 nautical mile. The housing rotated on a hydraulic mount, allowing the crew to train it independent of the aircraft's heading, which was crucial for the final moments of a diving attack run. But the critical innovation was not the light itself, it was the switch. The aircraft would pick up a radar contact in the dark and begin its approach using the ASV set. The radar gave them the range and bearing. They would fly in at low level, often as low as 50 meters above the water, closing the distance in the dark. The U-boat's METOX receiver was scanning for radar emissions, and if the aircraft had been using its radar continuously, the warning would have been received and the submarine would have dived long before the aircraft arrived. So the crew switched the radar off. Some miles out, typically around 5 to 8 kilometers, the navigator would shut down the ASV transmitter. No radar emissions meant no METOX warning. The aircraft continued its approach on dead reckoning, guided by the last known position and the crew's own judgment. The submarine on the surface had no idea anything was coming. Then, at roughly 1 mile out, close enough that even a crash dive would leave the submarine's stern and propellers exposed, close enough that the depth charge run could be completed before she could reach safety, the crew switched the Leigh Light on. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. After flying for perhaps 10 minutes in total darkness, the crew of the U-boat suddenly found themselves bathed in blinding white light. The transition from darkness to that intensity of illumination left their night-adapted eyes completely unable to function. They were, in the most immediate sense, blind. They could hear the aircraft. They could do nothing useful about it. They could not man the anti-aircraft guns effectively. They could not judge distances. They could not see the depth charges falling. The attacking aircraft, meanwhile, had all the information it needed. The light revealed the submarine clearly. The crew could make final adjustments to their attack line. The depth charges, typically a stick of 6 set to detonate at shallow depth, went into the water across the submarine's path, and the results were frequently lethal. Lee worked on early prototypes through 1941, often using his own savings and requisitioned equipment. The development program was conducted partly at the Aircraft and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down, and partly through trial and error. The first operational Leigh Light was fitted to a Wellington bomber of No. 172 Squadron, Coastal Command, and the unit began operations in June 1942. The first confirmed kill using the Leigh Light came on the 4th of July 1942, when a Wellington of No. 172 Squadron attacked the Italian submarine Luigi Torelli in the Bay of Biscay. The Luigi Torelli was severely damaged and forced to return to port. The psychological impact of the attack, the sudden, inexplicable appearance of blinding light from a dark sky, was noted in the surviving crew's accounts as profoundly disorientating. Over the following months, the Leigh Light began to reshape the tactical balance in the Bay of Biscay in ways that went beyond the simple arithmetic of submarines sunk. U-boat commanders who had previously crossed the bay on the surface, night after night, with confidence that their METOX receivers would give them adequate warning, now found themselves uncertain. The darkness that had been their ally was no longer reliable. Light could appear from nowhere. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The German response was initially confusion. After several attacks that seemed to have come from aircraft not using radar, the Kriegsmarine began investigating whether the British had developed some entirely new detection system, infrared perhaps, or acoustic. Karl Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat arm, received increasingly baffled reports from returning captains. The aircraft had appeared without warning. There had been no radar signal on the METOX. How was it possible? The answer, that the British had simply turned their radar off and used a torch, was so straightforward that it took some time to arrive at. When it did, the Germans implemented their own countermeasures, mounting heavier anti-aircraft armament on U-boats and attempting to fight back on the surface rather than diving. This produced a brief and costly period in which submarines engaged aircraft in open gun battles, with mixed results for both sides. The closest German equivalent to the Leigh Light was the Scheinwerfer system developed for their own maritime aircraft, but it was never employed with the same tactical sophistication, and German long-range maritime patrol capability was considerably more limited than that of Coastal Command. The Americans, for their part, adopted a modified version of the Leigh Light for their own patrol aircraft in the Atlantic and Pacific theaters, acknowledging the British system's effectiveness and largely duplicating its technical specifications. The crucial difference between the Leigh Light and other Allied illumination methods lay in the integration between radar, navigation, and the light itself as a weapons system. American approaches tended toward more powerful but less precisely employed illumination. The British method, the extended radar blackout followed by sudden full illumination at close range, was a tactical doctrine as much as a piece of technology, and it was the doctrine that made it lethal. German engineers did, in relatively short order, develop radar detection equipment capable of picking up the shorter wavelength radar sets that eventually replaced the original AS-5 in British aircraft. The introduction of the centimetric ASV Mark III, operating on a wavelength that existing METOX sets could not detect, extended the effectiveness of the radar and Leigh Light combination considerably. By the time the Germans had developed appropriate countermeasures, the broader Battle of the Atlantic had shifted decisively in the Allies' favor. The comparison that matters most, however, is not technical, but numerical. In the first half of 1942, before the Leigh Light entered service, Coastal Command aircraft flying over the Bay of Biscay were achieving roughly one attack per 350 flying hours. In the 6 months following the Leigh Light's introduction, that figure improved dramatically, with estimates suggesting an attack rate several times higher. Exact figures remain partially classified, but the direction of the trend is not in dispute. The legacy of the Leigh Light is, in the end, a story about the multiplying effect of a single tactical insight. The device itself was not particularly advanced. The light source was comparable to those used in film projectors of the period. The hydraulic mount was solid engineering but hardly extraordinary. The total weight of the installation, roughly 270 kilograms in early versions, was significant but manageable. What made it decisive was the recognition that the enemy's countermeasures could be defeated not by superior technology, but by superior tactics. The Metox receiver was a genuinely effective piece of equipment. It did exactly what it was designed to do, but it could only detect what was being transmitted, and if you stopped transmitting, it had nothing to detect. The weakness was not in the German equipment. It was in the German assumption that the British would always be using their radar. Dönitz's logs from late 1942 and early 1943 reflect a growing unease about the Bay of Biscay that goes beyond the tactical into something approaching existential uncertainty. He could not explain the losses. He could not reliably reconstruct what was happening to submarines that failed to return. The absence of information was as damaging as the losses themselves, because it meant he could not develop effective countermeasures. He was fighting a threat he could not fully characterize. The Leigh Light is not a famous weapon. It does not appear in the popular iconography of the Second World War. It is not the Spitfire or the Lancaster, but the argument can be made, and the numbers broadly support it, that the Battle of the Atlantic, which Churchill considered the war's most critical campaign, was materially influenced by a piece of equipment that a retired wing commander designed partly on his own initiative, using his own funds, working around the edges of an establishment that was initially skeptical of his idea. Examples of the Leigh Light survive in several British aviation collections, including examples associated with surviving Vickers Wellington aircraft. The device itself is modest in person, a cylinder of metal and glass mounted on a bracket. It does not look like something that changed the course of a war, but that is rather the point. Return, for a moment, to that U-boat in the Bay of Biscay in the autumn of 1942. The aircraft passed. No bombs fell. The crew surfaced again an hour later, continued on their heading, and eventually reached Lorient. They were the lucky ones. The crew that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time for the British aircraft, but early enough that the Leigh Light was not yet fitted to every patrol. By the following spring, the situation would be very different. U-boats crossing the Bay of Biscay were dying at a rate that shook the Kriegsmarine to its foundations. The months of May 1943 alone saw 43 U-boats sunk, a loss rate so catastrophic that Dönitz temporarily withdrew his forces from the North Atlantic entirely. The combination of improved radar, better convoy escort tactics, long-range patrol aircraft, and the Leigh Light had turned the transit route into a gauntlet that an increasing proportion of submarines simply did not survive. The crews knew it. Letters home from U-boat men in this period carry a fatalistic quality that was not present even a year before. They speak of the bay as a place to be feared, of aircraft appearing from nowhere, of the light that came without warning, of friends who set out and never came back, with no explanation, no wreckage, no survivors to report what had happened. Death in the Atlantic was often like that, complete, silent, leaving nothing behind. Humphrey Lee received the Legion of Merit from the United States and was officially credited with the invention of the device that bore his name. He died in 1964, a relatively obscure figure, even by the standards of wartime inventors. His innovation does not feature prominently in the standard histories. It is not the subject of feature films. But consider what it achieved. A device that cost almost nothing compared to a bomber, a warship, or a convoy, that required no exotic materials and no advanced science, that could be understood in principle in about 30 seconds. And that helped ensure that the ocean bridge between North America and Britain, the lifeline on which the entire Allied war effort ultimately depended, was not cut. The Germans tried jamming. They tried better radar warning systems. They tried fighting back with heavier guns. They tried changing their transit routes and their timing and their depth protocols. None of it was enough, because the weapon being used against them was not in the end a light at all. It was the understanding that the most effective deception is one that uses the enemy's defenses against themselves. Turn off the radar, wait for the darkness to do its work. Then, when it is already too late to matter, switch on the light.